மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.
Now we're going to have a look at another imbalance. This is the unbalanced position in which the rook and pawn, all pawns, are fighting against two light pieces. And this is a very common chess imbalance. I remember then that when I was younger, my coaches taught me that it's not a good idea to trade two light pieces for a rook and a pawn, and indeed in most of the cases it's not a good idea, especially in the opening. In the middle game and in most of the opening positions as well, two pieces are usually better than a rook and a pawn, or even a rook and two pawns. But things change in the end game, and the first sample that I would like to show you is the game between Richard III with the white pieces against Bogolyubov from Bad Kissingen 1928. If the side with the rook is having a pawn and this pawn is a pass pawn, it is usually the rook which is better, like it is in that case. So the plan for the second play is not only to advance the pawn that he has, the passer, this is the main thing that he is going to do, but also the rook would be doing plenty of good job. Here, with the starting move, it is attacking the weakness on e4 and is trying to force the enemy king to a passive situation, to a passive position to defend it. King went on f3. Of course, black also needs to centralize his king. He plays king f7, bishop h4, the rook is moved on b1, knight c4, the king comes to the center, king e6, and bishop g3 was played to attack the pawn. This attack is fake. It's not really something that black has to be afraid of. It was probably better for white to try and to block the pawn while it is still on a6, not to allow it to go too much far away. But in the game he probably thought that now black would be forced to go into passive defense with rook b5. Instead of that, Bogolyubov played rook c1, and it transpired that taking the pawn on e5 is not a good idea for white, because after rook c3 check, black is taking back the two light pieces, and in that particular case he would be having an outside pass pawn on the a file. Even if it is not promoted immediately, it will be winning the game anyway. The pawn endgame is easily won for the second player. So taking on c5 on e5 is not a good idea for white, and instead of that he had to go into passive defense. He played knight a5. Now rook e1, knight c4, rook a4, and after all this preparation the pawn is finally moving, but it is moving in a very fast way. So first rook a3, king e2 a4, knight c2, rook b3, king e2, king e2 a4, knight c2, rook b3, bishop b4 was played to try and to stop the pawn before it goes too far away. And that's a situation which is very typical for this endgames. White managed to block the pawn, but in doing that he had to use both his light pieces. So one of these pieces is blocking the pawn, it is stopping it, and the other one is supporting it. And that's a nice situation which the stronger side is using, while in order to improve the position he starts advancing the pawns on the other side of the board, and there he's trying to create a second weakness or to fix a weakness and then to attack on both flanks with the rook. The rook is attacking easily on either flank, and this is its main power. So h5, bishop f8 was played, and g5. Now if white does nothing, the next move is going to be g4, and after that the rook will come on b1 and start attacking the pawns like that along the first rank, and soon after white's defense would be broken. He cannot defend both the flanks with his pieces, as two of them are sent on the queen side, and the king alone cannot handle the rook. Plus black can always bring the reserves with the king coming on c4 later. h3 was played, and now black starts to to try and to somehow stretch the defense of his opponent, he is attacking on every single angle of the board, and at the end white is making a mistake. You will see king e2, rook b2, king d3, rook b1, intending to bring the rook on g1. So far it is not really a threat, but okay, he's trying to spoil somehow the coordination of the white pieces. He even attacks this bishop with rook f1, bishop c5, rook to f4, king to d3, and now the rook goes on f7. After bishop e3, he is giving a check on d7, trying to see where exactly the king is going, and then he goes rook g7. So after all these maneuvers, black is finally creating a threat, and this is the threat of advancing the pawn further on g4. Probably this wasn't the greatest threat on earth, and at the moment it was a good idea for white just to stand still and to see what exactly is happening. In case of g4, he can trade the pawns, and the less material there is on the board, the better the chances will be for him to make a draw. Note that one of the key defensive resources in these situations for the two light pieces is to try to trade all the pieces, even on the expense of one of his light pieces, and then the resulting endgame is usually a draw, theoretical draw, say rook versus a bishop or rook versus a knight. The other plan that black can do, besides the move g4, is to try and to bring the king all the way to c4. So there is still a lot of life in this situation, but if white is careful, he can probably hold. Instead of waiting patiently, he decided to stab the pawn with g4. He's blocking the pawn on g5, and eventually this is a weakness that I guess he believed he can attack with the bishop. But this doesn't matter anymore, as after the great move h4, the pawn on h3 has been fixed, and this is the decisive weakness now on the king side. All black needs to do is to reactivate the rook. This is how he did it in the game. And the active rook is attacking the pawn on h3. The pawn on h3 cannot be defended, and white's defense is now stretched. He cannot deal with the two passers, which is so distant one from another, and he is losing material. King b4 was played, a3, knight takes a3, and rook takes a3. That was the end of the game, practically, as white doesn't have time to take the rook. The pawn would be promoted, therefore he took on h4, but this also doesn't help. After rook e3, king c4, black is taking both the pawns, and thus he is winning the game as well. Rook g4, bishop f2, king f5, there is not even a hint of a fortress. And after rook a4, king f3, rook e3 check, bishop e3 and rook b3, white resigned. So what I want you to remember, what you can remember from this clip, above all, is that the endgames with rook and pawn, or pawns versus two light pieces, when we have a pass pawn, especially if it is an outside pass pawn and a distant pawn from one of the flanks, are favorable for the side which is having the rook.
மறக்காம சர்ப்ரைஸ் பண்ணுங்க. Thank you.